noted on the agenda, we are going to take the SSC report in full this morning, then we'll circle back to action on agenda item B4. That looks like we have Dr. Ann Hollowood available to give the presentation. Good morning, Dr. Hollowood.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. My name is Ann Hollowood. I'm here on behalf of the SSC. I will be giving a summary of our report from the April meeting. The report will go over our comments and suggestions and responses for agenda items B3, Seabird status, B3, EFH 5-year review, C1, scallop harvest specs, C2, halibut abundance-based management, D5, salmon genetics, D6, EDR workshops and SSPT report, D7, research priorities, and D8, the ASEPO report. And so what I will do, the order of the slides will be that I will work through each of those agenda items, and then I will stop after I complete the summary for those and see if there's any questions from the SSC. So the first agenda item is B3 Seabird status report. We received an update of the status of seabirds in waters off of the coast of Alaska. That the discussion focused on 3 primary issues: the bycatch of seabirds in commercial fisheries, the distribution and movements of seabirds, and evidence of mass mortality or die-off events. And so starting with seabird bycatch, the numbers of seabird, of bycaught seabirds in general and albatrosses in particular has declined somewhat in 2020. There is some evidence that seabirds may be, the incidental take of seabirds may be more likely to occur when there are mass mortality events. And to try and look into that possible correlation, the SSC suggests that measuring the body mass of bycaught seabirds might provide some evidence of starvation and emaciation. And if bycatch is driven by starvation, then the mass mortality events in a given year may provide an indication that bycatch avoidance will be difficult in that particular year. So it could be used as an index. In terms of the catch of endangered or threatened species, 2 short-tailed albatrosses were caught in 2020. The BIOP allows 6 takes in 2 years. There were also encounters with eiders. There was 1 stellar eider, and there are 3 takes in 3 years. So of course we need to pay attention to that. And then there was a take of spectacled eider in 2019, and in response to that, BIOP was pulled together, and there's a rolling takes of no more than 25 takes in a rolling 4-year period. And so just to alert the council of those constraints. In looking at the encounters with eiders, it became clear that that they were occurring at night and were perhaps attracted by deck lights. And so the 2021 BIOP suggests the use of deck lights be minimized, of course, within safety limits. There's obviously some balance here. And to evaluate possible remediation efforts, the SSC requests data on the dates and times of day and species and number of birds landing on the ships so that the fishing fleets might adjust their behavior proactively. In terms of shifts in distribution and abundance, there were reports of planktivorous birds shifting their distribution southward from the Chukchi Sea in 2018-2019. And the SSC recommends that seabird observers be placed on research vessels in federal waters, as shifting seabird distributions may provide an indication of shifting prey base, which is of course shared with important commercial species. The mass mortality events and the beach cats, seabirds, there were several major die-offs in 2018 and 2019, but fewer in 2020, which was a good sign. And as you know from last fall, things were returning more to normal to the extent that we could measure it in terms of environmental conditions. In the northern Bering Sea, the principal die-offs were zooplanktivorous auklets, and their primary prey were large copepods, euphausids, and amphipods, whereas in the southeastern Bering Sea, it was mostly shearwaters, and their prey base is slightly different. And just trying to track what sorts of prey fields are there is where we're going. The limited evidence that we have suggests that the major cause of these die-offs was starvation. And in light of that, the SSC requests that the authors develop a time series of die-offs that includes not only the raw numbers of dead birds that are counted on the beach, but there's an effort to attempt to standardize the time series for the number of kilometers walked or number of days walked. Some sort of standardization of the counts would be quite useful. And those time series then, once standardized, could be related to various indices of climate and change in fish recruitment. So that is the end of my summary of discussions about seabird status, the status report. Are there any clarifying questions that I need to answer?
Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Holloway. On the first couple of slides, I think you had a couple new potential paths for observers. One in particular about requesting data on the date, time of day, species, and number of birds landing on ships. Am I understanding that correctly, that that's an SSC request for a new observer task? And was anyone at SMA available for this meeting to discuss whether that might be possible?
No, it was just a request on our behalf that we begin to look into the feasibility of doing that kind of thing. Whether or not of course, the major mission of the observers are to monitor the catch, and if it's not feasible, we understand. But to the extent that some counts or weights could be taken, this would be useful.
Thank you.
Okay, should I move on?
Please.
So our next agenda item was the Central Fish Habitat 5-year review and planning, and we reviewed the plans for the upcoming 5-year review that's scheduled to be completed by the end of 2022, and we commend the contributors for the substantial progress to date and their responsiveness to past SSC comments. The SSC does recommend additional SSC review will be necessary to fully vet the products resulting from this 5-year review. What we don't want is to come to the end of 2022 and find issues with it that could have been resolved as the process is going forward. And we recognize that the products of the EFH are hierarchical and interdependent, and they inform multiple non-EFH council data streams and products. And that, as we heard from public testimony, we think these additional reviews would help with the public's perception of transparency. So these additional reviews what we recommend is that we take a 2-part approach for the review. The first review would be in October 21, and that would be focused on the species distribution models and the results from discussion from the federal stock assessors. So right now, the species distribution maps have been handed off to the stock assessment scientists, and the idea was to review that product in October. The second review we would hope would occur sometime in the spring, either February or April, where we would be looking at the fishing effects models and the responses to the SSC comments from the October 21 meeting. And this way we can feel comfortable that what we're receiving in June has been fully vetted. And so that is a summary of our overall comments. There are more details in the minutes. Are there any questions about EFH?
Doesn't look like it. Please continue.
Okay, then I'll proceed. The next agenda item is the scallop harvest specifications. And this year we received an executive summary of the SAFE. It was a truncated, shortened, but provided key information to establish the ABC and the OFL. In terms of stock status, the SSC agrees with the scallop plan team that the stock status is unknown. This is because while we are beginning to get abundance estimates at the bed level, we don't have an abundance level over the entire range of the species. It should be noted, however, that the exploitation is well below the ABC in recent years. So as a conservation concern, this is less of an issue. The stock was not overfished in 2019-2020, and we didn't have information to look at any for more recently than that. The SSC recommends setting the OFL for the 2021-2022 season equal to the max OY, that's 582 tons, and an ABC at 524 tons, and this is consistent with the Scallop FMP levels, and it's consistent with the recommendation from the plant team in the office. The SSC supports additional flexibility in the specification schedule for the, for example, exploring whether or not we could have a multi-year assessment. So in groundfish, we often have biennial, 2-year, and we set a specifications for we have a 2-year gap between assessments, and in the intervening time, we have a partial assessment similar to what we received for scallop. And it was noted that to do that, there would have to be some exploration of the FMP to examine whether or not that's actually feasible. And so we encourage looking into whether or not there actually has to be an FMP, or if there is a way to have 2 years look aheads similar to what we do in groundfish. The SSC had several recommendations for the upcoming scallop safe in the next year. We continue to reiterate the need for research on scallop stock structure. Managing this resource over the very large range that we do depends on the advection of the reproductive products that come from the different beds, and ensuring that is an acceptable way of managing the stock continues to be a question for us, and so this stock structure idea would be important. And of course, since the beds are relatively discrete, that kind of research could take place. We also are encouraged about the progress towards an age length based assessment, and we look forward to taking a look at that. We also appreciated that they're collecting environmental covariates on the surveys that they have, and examining the relationship between those environmental covariates and meat weight and how it might influence survey design is certainly something we'd like to have the authors consider. The inclusion of the ADF and G large mesh trawl survey data certainly is intriguing, and the information that we received looked like it would be a useful index, and so as available, we'd like the authors to begin to track that. In the document, there was a recommendation for a change in the measurement of shell height, and we agree that this is a good change. However, we feel that there needs to be some way of transitioning so that we can interpret the historical data and the new data. So to the extent that there could be some comparison of top shell, outer shell measurements, it would be quite useful. And we'd like them to provide a description and presentation on the survey design and the new two-stage estimation method. They are looking at the fishery footprint within the beds or within the region, and then estimating the abundance in that region, and having more information on that would be useful. And finally, we're supportive of efforts by ADF and G to make the fishery dependent and fishery independent data electronically available for this resource. And that's the extent of our comments on agenda item C1. Are there any questions on this?
Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Hollywood, on the previous slide, I just want to make sure I understand it. The SSC has identified that possibly an annual assessment isn't necessary for scallops, and so I just want to make sure I'm reading this right, that the FMP itself requires an annual assessment, and so the SSC's recommendation is that if we have an opportunity to revisit that with an FMP amendment that doesn't require an annual assessment, we should do so. But in the meantime, the SSC hopes to see kind of an executive summary type safe in order to be more efficient in this review. Am I capturing that?
Yes, essentially what we're saying is that the setting of the ABC and the OFL has been relatively stable for this resource, and that reviewing it every year is perhaps not as important. It's similar to some of the groundfish stocks where we review them. We have a full safe every other year, and so exploring mechanisms to allow us to have an executive summary type safe document, and perhaps biennial, a 2-year ABCs and OFLs would be something that the SSC would like us to explore. And we realized we couldn't resolve this issue at this meeting because of this issue with how the F&P is written. So it's a request to explore this, our options underneath this constraint.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a follow-up, Dr. Hollowood, then the F&P doesn't constrain the ability of the Science Center staff to provide an executive summary SAFE. It just needs to provide some kind of SAFE annually. Like, is that something that could be done next year without having an F&P amendment?
It's not clear to us. If that would be feasible, then certainly that would be an acceptable way to go.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any more questions on scallop?
Doesn't look like it.
Okay, so the next agenda item was C2 halibut abundance space management. And at this meeting, the SSC reviewed all aspects of the DEIS and the DSIA, including the new material that was presented in October 2020. If you remember, we received that information. There were some model changes very late in the process, and so we didn't comment on the merits of the model at that time. And certainly we do now. And these documents describe the proposed management measures to index halibut PSC limits for the Amendment 80 sector to indices of halibut abundance, including all combinations of the alternatives and options. And we received extensive, just as the council has, written and oral testimony on this topic, and those clearly highlight the importance and challenges of this action. And the SSC wishes to recognize the extensive work that the analysis team has put into continually adapting to changing requests by the public and the council and the options therein. They've done a great job of responding to those changes. Our review suggests that we don't support using the results of the simulation model, and our rationale for not supporting it is threefold. The first is that we had concerns about the treatment of size at age. The model has the option for having time varying size at age, but in this iteration, those options were not turned on, so it was fixed size at age. And of course, halibut is quite responsive to changing environmental conditions. The recruitment cycle, specifically the number of PDOs used in the simulation, gives some idea, but it was really only one cycle that went forward. And then finally, the coast-wide harvest level and allocation to the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, and I'll get into the details on that one. These were all reasons why we felt a simpler approach is probably most useful. And we've learned a lot from these models, and we feel that you can move forward after some changes to the document, given the information that we have at hand. So, for example, one of the key findings from the simulation model was that the implications of the action on spawning biomass would have very little impact on the overall status of the stock as a whole. And this is primarily we support that conclusion because we recognize that the Halibut Commission uses a spawner per recruit type analysis, and the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council uses similar approaches in the tier system for groundfish. And so both of those are constraints that recognize the importance of spawning biomass, and therefore we feel that the implications on halibut spawning biomass over time from this amendment package would be there would be very little influence on amongst the alternatives, with the exception of extremely high PSC. The SSC also does not support using the simulated probabilities of future states of nature in each cell from the lookup tables. This is our concern here was that in light of the dynamic recent changes observed in the BSI AI in terms of shifting spatial distribution of the resources, that the SSC suggests that the predictability is low of what state those surveys would be in, and that the council should not base its evaluation on the likelihood of any given future state of nature. The SSC also does not support, with those two pieces in the background, using the simulated ratios of change in PSC to change in halibut fisheries limits. We recognize that these ratios will change over time, and a single most likely value probably will not represent the range of likely effects. And therefore, we are recommending that the council provides a table like what you have in ES5, but it just presents a range of ratios varying from 0 to 1 without a specific likelihood of any one of those ratios being the most likely. As currently employed, the SSC finds that the simulation model does not provide an objective exploration of the possible consequences and risks associated with the alternatives under consideration, and for all those reasons I've just gone over. However, we want to recognize that the analysis team was doing the right thing, and they were responding to the SSC's request for this sort of idea. We as a body don't want to be clear that we do feel like there is great value in closed loop simulation modeling, and we recognize that the working group was on the right track. It's just as in any model, there are simplifying assumptions, and we think that there's enough information currently available to the council with what it has that it doesn't have to rely on this. And so we don't want to discourage this type of analysis in the future, and we recognize the real expertise and work that went into providing the model that you have. The SSC appreciates that the revisions to the revenue and impacts assessment, but we recommend that the analysis be revised to include more empirical evidence to clarify the degree to which halibut abundance indices reflect Amendment 80 encounter rates. Our concern here is that encounter rates are more unpredictable than just having a direct linear relationship with underlying halibut abundance. The SSC cautions against comparisons of revenue impacts between the two sectors, as the impacts are highly uncertain and don't equate to a comparison of value. Remember, the Amendment 80 fleet is measured in wholesale value, and the halibut is measured in ex-vessel value, and while the gross revenue could be looked at, it doesn't include the costs, and the costs are quite different between the two sectors, and therefore it's difficult to compare the cost implications of these two What we do recommend is that we estimate revenue impacts for comparing across alternatives within a sector, but not across sectors. The SSC recommends that an additional discussion be added to the EIS on interannual variability in PSC among the IPHC regulatory areas in the BSAI, and the observed potential effects on halibut fisheries. And we recommend that the DEIS be advanced, as I said, given those changes that we think are feasible, given the information that we have at hand. We think that the DEIS could be advanced for public review after these revisions were made. We also read through the SIA, and we really didn't have any comments on it. We felt it was very useful, and it allows the council to understand the fishery policy impacts, the fishery and policy impacts of the alternative. I think that's. Oh, there's one more. Yes, the SSC raised the issue of using absolute indices of abundance in the lookup tables. And the reason we're concerned about this is that the halibut survey is a derived from a spatial temporal modeling estimate. And therefore, any new data or changes in the method used for that survey could change the application in the tables due to and which might not be consistent with their intent at the onset. And what we recommend is converting these indices to values that relative to a year or a group of years, which would not change in the application, but would avoid potential scaling problems in the future use of the tables. The SSC recommends that the council consider how and with what frequency an adopted alternative could be reevaluated. We realize that sometime in the future we should take a look at how this amendment has played out, and we think that would be a very useful exercise to revisit this sometime in the future. And in light of the challenges encountered in this analysis, we encourage the council to examine the lessons learned and consider ways in which it could be improved in the future, both for efficiency and transparency and consistency of PSC actions. It has been a long time coming, and we feel that, as I said, a lot of lessons have been learned through the process. And that, I think, is my last slide. Yeah. So are there any questions on halibut abundance-based management?
Looks like there are. First is Mr. Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Howard. And if I missed it, I apologize. Was there discussion among the SSC about one of the, it says in the beginning, you said in the beginning, this is kind of a policy decision, et cetera, but was there any talk about the practicality of the Amendment 80 sector ability to avoid halibut to any degree on the way the lookup tables and some of this was put together? Was there a discussion on that?
Thank you, through the chair. Thank you, Mr. Cross. We did discuss the need, as I mentioned, the need to have in the DEIS an evaluation of the relationship between halibut bycatch and halibut abundance, so that there could be greater transparency in terms of when those encounters occur and how often they occur under different levels of the status of halibut. And so that was the main extent that we addressed that issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Hollywood. I have a few questions, but I'll start with one related to Mr. Cross's question. And so I appreciate that response. I'm looking at page 13 of the SSC minutes, the last full paragraph on that page. And under just after the bold text that the SSC finds the current DEIS to fall short in its consideration of this possibility, the next sentence says the existence of a positive relationship between the halibut abundance indices and Amendment 80 halibut encounter rates is a key premise underlying this action. And I don't necessarily share that view, so I'm wondering if the SSC had much discussion on whether that's clearly a premise in the analysis that's very clear that is important for the council to be aware of, or I'm just wondering how much discussion you had of that, because that's not necessarily my interpretation.
So to say we had extensive conversations on this, we didn't, as in the case of all of you, we were limited by time, but that underscores my response to Mr. Cross, that this is something that needs to be included in the package so that the public is aware of the relationship or lack thereof. There are other reasons, of course, to reduce bycatch under the national standards, and so this is one element of it, but tying it to abundance is part of it.
Okay, thank you. Follow-up question, Mr. Chair?
Ms. Baker.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to go back, I think it was on slide 13, Dr. Hollywood, and it's on page 11 of the SSC minutes. I just wanted to understand the recommendation that the SSC recommends that the council compare alternatives based on a range of plausible ratios from 0 to 1 without an implicit or explicit likelihood assigned to each. Yes, so thank you. The last bullet there. I guess the specific example cited in the SSC minutes is the relative fraction of O26 versus U26 in the PSE as an example of how an important ratio that we should maybe look at a range from 0 to 1 rather than having probabilities. But I guess I'm not quite sure how the council is supposed to be assisted in making a decision, quite frankly. If we're looking at a range from 0 to 1, I'm not aware, and I could be wrong about this, but I'm not aware that there's ever been 100% O26 PSE or 100% U26 PSE. And so I guess I just, on its face, those aren't likely effects to me. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out if our analyses take the SSC recommendations there in that last bullet with receiving an entire range of ratios from 0 to 1 without any likelihood assigned to each, how is the council supposed to decide what is a likely effect then? I'm just kind of struggling with that.
Through the chair and Ms. Baker, I recognize this issue is a change, or the SSC recognizes that this is a change. The idea here is to provide the scope of plausible outcomes and over the entire range of those ratios. I think you are right that the 0 and 1 represent the bounds of the possible outcomes. The difficulty is trying to say the values in, for example, the median, as it is currently in ES5, is the most likely value. And so the importance is that the public understands the range of plausible impacts of the action on Amendment 80 and directed halibut, and can make a rational decision on how to go forward given that potential range of values.
Okay, thank you for that. And Mr. Chair, if I may, I have one more question.
Please, Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Dr. Holwood. My final question is sort of general. I'm trying to thread together a few related recommendations from the SSC throughout this agenda item, and so I'll start with sort of one of the final take-home recommendations was that the SSC encourages the council to examine lessons learned during this progress, and you spoke to it a couple of different times during your presentation, and so I appreciate that recommendation. It is important to do that. I'm trying to think back. I think the decision to develop a halibut operating model for this particular action, the closed loop simulation analysis, largely stemmed from SSC and public comments on the analysis prepared for the Council's 2015 halibut PSC limit reduction action. And so I think given concerns about that analysis, we sort of embarked on this different approach that, as we've continually heard as a council, I'm sure you've heard at the SSC, has taken quite some time to develop. And so that we can recognize that now, the time it's taken, and then in the end, I think at the last meeting when we reviewed the results from the halibut operating model, I realized the SSC did not at the October meeting. We kind of learned from, at least my takeaway from the analysis from the analysts was that the model results were not particularly useful for comparing impacts across alternatives. And that was a bit of an eye-opener, I think, to some council members. And so I'm struggling to reconcile the recommendation that the council examine lessons learned during this process with the recommendation that closed loop simulation analysis could be useful for decision making, because I'm also reading in the SSC minutes that one of the challenges with this process has been that the council changed alternatives based on information it received in public testimony and other things, and that's been problematic, which is, of course, a normal part of our process. So I guess that's kind of, sorry to ramble a little bit, but my question is, can we drill down a little bit in terms of the value of performing closed loop analyses for informing decision making, and then the SSC's caution to remember lessons learned for PSC action specifically? How can we do closed loop simulation analysis of these types while responding to public pressure that we need to take action quickly on important agenda items? I guess it's probably not a fair question, but I think it speaks to the SSC recommendation on lessons learned. So I'd appreciate your thoughts on that.
Through the chair and Ms. Baker, we recognize that this was in part our idea and our recommendation to move towards this type of modeling framework. And I do think the lessons that have been learned are that these types of modeling exercises are complicated, and just as in our stock assessment modeling efforts, the first version is not necessarily accepted by the SSC as acceptable for use for decision making. The importance is, and the council is embarking on it through the FEP, is to begin to develop these tools so they are available to the council to be adapted more in a smaller amount of time. Building one from the ground up is a challenging activity, and this is perhaps one of the most challenging amendments that the council has taken on. And so that is an important aspect to think about. But I do think as we circle back around and look at how this process evolved, I think that there are perhaps ways to encourage the development of closed loop simulations. Perhaps in the next 5 years, the model would be ready to do something that, you know, as we look back at how this, whatever decision the council makes, plays out. As we look back, as you noted in our minutes, we recommend going back. Perhaps at that point, continued work on the closed loop analysis could provide something that would be more useful going forward. It's just, rather than holding this up again, it seems that we have enough information for the public and the council, and it's scientifically sound to make a good decision now, and that's why we're making the recommendation we are.
Thanks for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Dr. Holloway.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Mr. Mesereau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Holloway, for your presentation. I believe it was slide 16, where it was the one slide where the SSC strongly recommended, and I don't know, you lost me on that one. I was tracking. There you go. Could you just explain that a little bit further? I think you really lost me on that, and I was tracking everything else you talked about, and I feel like if you strongly caution against doing this, then I want to understand better what you were trying to strongly caution us against using.
So, through the chair, Mr. Mesereau, the rationale here is the recognition that the IPHC longline survey uses a model-based spatial temporal model of abundance. And if the parameters for that abundance estimation are changed in some way, or if even in the bottom trawl survey, if we change catchability or selectivity of the nets, this will change the absolute values from the survey. And so the key here is to make sure that we use relative indicators so that they aren't subject to the individual changes that could take place in either the National Marine Fisheries Service or the IPHC service that might change the relationship upon which this decision would be made.
Thank you.
Mr. Mesereau. Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Holloway. One of my questions was on that very point that Mr. Mesereau just brought up, and because what I'm interpreting that on the recommendation on slide 17 is that we return to standardizing the indices, and I'm sure that the SSC was aware of our struggles with that in previous iterations. We were really highly prioritizing transparency through providing, indices that provided absolute values like we do for every other PSC caps on other species. We don't provide a standardized indices, we provide it on absolute value. And so I'm really wondering, and I did look at the document, and I do see how it tried to address this and the move from standardizing into absolute values. And I think one of the things that the analysts brought forward was that we weren't seeing changes in any significant way, no massive changes in the Shetland survey that you mentioned year to year. And so while standardizing might be the ideal, don't we have some kind of trade-off there on transparency versus a real need to do that to avoid those scaling problems? I'm hoping to get a little more discussion on that, because we made a deliberate decision to move off of that, meeting or so ago.
Through the chair and Ms. Kimball, I recognize that everything you just noted. The key is, if you do stick with absolutes, the council needs to be aware that should NIMS change the selectivity, change its nets, or change how it estimates abundance, there's a change in the catchability or the selectivity of the net for whatever reason, and likewise in the case of the model estimates for the IPHC, that there needs to be some adjustments to these units, since they form the basis for this amendment as it stands in terms of absolute units. So if you do, it's just a precautionary tale that this could be a problem if there's any change in either of the surveys.
Okay, I appreciate that. I have a separate question, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Kimball.
Thank you. I was just wondering, Dr. Holloway, on slide 15, because I was looking at this myself very carefully in the analysis, and the SSC's recommending that you only compare, revenue impacts across alternatives within the same sector. And I wondered if the SSC saw an instance of this in the analysis that spurred this level of caution. I only bring it up because I felt like they caveated those revenue impacts very heavily and deliberately did not compare across sectors, only within sectors. So I'm hoping you could point out if there are instances where we missed that, or this is just kind of a recommendation that they continue to do what they did in the analysis already.
Through the chair, Ms. Kimball, our recommendation is just to make sure that the council and the public and everyone knows that this is the way there's always a temptation to look at the trade-offs across sectors, and that these are really most useful, and the best use of them should be within a sector across alternatives.
Okay, thank you. I understand that. And then my last question was just because I did hear some from the public about, confusion about what to use the model for in the future, in future versions of the analyses. And so in your minutes, I'm just trying to be very clear. It's on page 10 of your minutes that the SSC, and I appreciate how this was lined out, had identified 3 important results for comparing alternatives that were based, at least in part on the simulation model. And so the SSC is supporting the general conclusion that we're not going to see a lot of difference on future halibut spawning biomass under the alternatives, and that the model's general trend on that conclusion is appropriate, but the SSC does not support continuing to use the model for the probabilities of future states, like Ms. Baker already talked about, and the potential changes in how directed halibut fishery limits as a result of changes in PSC. Those are the 2 pieces that we wouldn't continue. The SSC would recommend we would not continue to use the model to provide results for. Is that did I get that right?
Yes, through the chair and Ms. Kimball, yes. yes, that's where we're going, that we feel that there's sufficient constraints within the Halibut Commission on using spawner per recruit type models, that the conclusion about protecting spawning biomass is still valid.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Kendall. Mr. Twite.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And Dr. Holloway, thank you for, on behalf of the whole SSC, for the amount of work that went into particularly this review. It's extremely thorough, and I found it really helpful in crystallizing my thinking on a couple of areas. My attention was also caught by the strong caution, and my thoughts ran along the lines that Ms. Kimball expressed. Well, this isn't the only area where we use absolute values, and so is the SSC cautioning us against suggesting that maybe we want to consider finding a transparent way of doing this more broadly? But then I started to think about, well, but halibut has been uniquely challenging. We've had difficulty assessing the impact of differing estimates of biomass from differing survey types. We've had difficulty assessing the effects of a lot of this. Has been a much more complex and confounding analysis than any of us ever imagined it would be when we first proposed this. And so I was wondering if really that was at play here. If the SSC was essentially warning us that given two different management entities, given the differing methods for estimating biomass that don't provide similar, that we're much more likely with halibut to see future changes than we might be with a lot of the other assessment techniques that we use to as a basis for our bycatch controls for other species. So is this a reflection of just how complex and challenging this one has been, that the SSC is making this kind of a recommendation, or am I reading way too much into it?
Through the chair, Mr. Twite, we did not look more broadly across all other amendments that use abundance indices. This was just a recognition of for a recommendation for this amendment package, and we would I can't really say anything more beyond that. The one thing that we did note in our minutes is that the IPHC does use spatial temporal type modeling design. So, but I can't go on to the broader sense of whether it should be looked at across the board.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Twite. Further questions on ABM?
Okay. So let's see. Oh, I went backwards. Sorry. Okay, so the next agenda item is salmon genetics, and the SSC received several reports on updates of both chum and Chinook salmon bycatch, and we appreciate being able to catch up on all of those responses, and we also appreciate the analysts' responses to our recommendations from the 2019 Salmon Bycatch Workshop and our past recommendations. we are really encouraged by, and you will see in the upcoming presentations and we support the progress being made on adopting new technologies for streamlining the analysis, the genetic analysis. The use we support the switch to the GTSQ, that's genotyping in the thousands by sequencing is what that refers to. We see that as a cost-effective way of moving forward. We agree with the idea of moving to SNPs as a baseline, and we agree with the data analysis switch to Rubius, and we are particularly encouraged by the integration of the information into Axon. And so all of these pieces are leading us to an improvement in the quality of the scientific information we'll receive, as well as how timely it is in terms of being processed. We recommend that an update on the progress being made for each of those recommendations from the 2019 workshop and the recent SSC reports be provided at some point. The SSC suggested a clear state of management objectives might be developed to take full advantage of the data being collected. And so we encourage the analysts to perhaps step back and think about, as they move, you'll see in the presentation that's upcoming that they're encouraged on beginning to look at spatial temporal patterns, and as you move outside of the direct analysis of what was the stock composition of the bycatch and looking at what inference you can make from the samples that you have, we encourage that we make sure that the sampling plan and the way they're interpreting the data is based on a suite of clear management objectives. And that was the extent of our analysis on our response to salmon genetics, generally fairly favorable. Are there any questions on salmon genetics?
Ms. Kimball has a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick one, Dr. Holloway, on the update, the recommendation on the update on progress being made on the 2019 workshop. I didn't get to hear that part of the SSC presentation or discussion. Did the SSC not get to hear an update on any of those priorities that were identified in that 2019 motion from the council? And I'm speaking directly to the need to process the backlog of scales for Chinook salmon, update the age length key, some of those key things that I thought were going to be part of the genetic presentation, but not having received that presentation, I'm not sure if that's part of it. And is this more of a general recommendation that we continue to provide this as part of the overall report when we see genetics, or is it something more specific than that?
Yeah, through the chair and Ms. Kimball, it is more generic in the sense that to the extent that we have any recommendations that we've brought forward, we'd like to see a progress report being made, and so it's more of a generic recommendation.
Thank you.
Please continue.
Okay, so the next agenda item is the EDR workshops and the SSPT report. And the SSC really commends the organizers of the EDR workshop. The involvement of stakeholders, the involvement of the SSPT, and the involvement of staff for their work in developing recommendations for changes to the EDRs. This was really a good use of everyone's time. the SSC appreciates the approach of the SSPT and agrees that taking a step back to examine what data are really needed for what questions and subsequent analyses is an important step. Certainly, we don't want to stop collecting data if it has an inherent use, and also we don't want to be burdening industry with providing that information if it's not necessarily necessary. So the SSC acknowledges that that to collect and utilize the data efficiently, the questions for which the data are collected need to be identified first. And so we support the SSPT's idea of looking cleanly at why were these data being collected and how will they be used. The SSC identified 3 primary reasons that the goals for the EDRs might be revisited, and those were to determine whether there are different considerations for labs when they are reviewed for the second time. So maybe things have changed and there needs to be a modification of what we're collecting, to consider the current relevance of the EDRs overall, and to identify what information is needed across EDRs. And in support of this, we agree with the SSPT recommendation to revisit the purpose and need statements of the individual programs. And the SSC supports the SSPT recommendation to explore a more holistic program for collecting baseline socioeconomic information as raised in issue 2 of the Council's April 2019 report. And so those are our main comments on EDRs. Before standardizing the elements across EDRs as suggested by the SSPT, the SSC recommends examining what questions need to be answered across all fisheries. And the SSC also recommends identifying needs for broad data collections across fisheries before discontinuing the current EDR collections. The SSC recognizes, just a minute, I've got it, I apologize, I need to step out for a minute.
No problem with this,
Sorry, there was a machine running in my house. Sorry for that interruption.
No problem. Okay.
SSC recognizes that developing a framework for broad data collections is a critical step and has been included in both developing a framework and collecting data as part of the top 10 research priorities. And I'll get to that under our analysis of D7. And finally, the SSC finds the SSPT recommended small changes to individual EDRs are valuable and suggests that these be considered by the Council. And so, in general, we were very pleased by the EDR workshops. We were very pleased by and we accept many of the SSPT recommendations for going forward. However, we do feel like this idea.
What do you think you're going to?
I apologize, Dr. Holloway. Let me remind members of the public to please mute your phones. Try again,
So,
Dr. Holloway.
yeah, that's the end of my presentation on D6.
Okay.
Are there any questions on D6? Like none. So,
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I was slow on that.
Oh, apologies, Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Dr. Holloway. I'm wondering, kind of in what order you think the priorities are for either revising the EDR or creating a more general framework for more general, data collection, some trend information that we could collect across labs or even non-lab fisheries. I think what resulted from the SSPT's work are some very minor changes that you're suggesting the council consider, but we don't have any substantive recommendations on any of the other pieces, whether we're collecting data to answer our original questions, whether the data we're collecting under the current EDR is actually answering those questions or can be translated into answering those questions or shouldn't be used to answer those questions, and whether we're still putting our efforts kind of in the right bucket with those questions or whether they've been answered and we should move on to a general framework. And there's a lot here, and I was trying to digest it and do my own prioritization, but I'm wondering if you could highlight what the SSC thinks is the highest priority and who should be working on that.
Through the chair and Ms. Kimball, our thinking is that we feel that the SSPT is the logical body to be advancing that type of decision making, and what we're trying to say is that developing using the product of the workshop as a foundation for identifying the key questions that are being asked and the primary needs for the broad data collections across fisheries is going to be a key step in trying to identify what the council should be really looking at, and in terms of a broader, more holistic look at collection of EDR type data. Within that, the idea of developing a framework is an essential piece of that. And so thinking of the framework of the types of data needed to do that is really why we're emphasizing this in our top 10 research priorities. I hope that's an adequate response. If not, I certainly can follow up.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just wait for the research priorities. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Kimball. Mr. Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Hallett. When you say, I'm kind of trying to get a grip on what is broad data collection, is that mean that the SSC is recommending we now extend this past rationalized programs? Could you give me an idea of what you mean by broad data collections? Does that include going after other fisheries and getting their data, or what was meant by that?
No, it wasn't extending beyond other fisheries, but the idea was to within the EDRs that we have, to try and see if there are similarities in the overall needs of key data sets that need to be collected, and that we ensure that we also look at how the data that is currently being collected is being used in the broader council analysis process. So the information that is being collected is now being used in economic analyses and impact analyses. And so having that data set, we now know how it can be used in the greater uses of it. And so taking a careful look at if we're going to redesign how EDR data is collected, that there needs to be an overarching look at what are the needs for it and make sure that we don't discontinue something that has inherent value.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Press. Additional questions?
Okay, the next agenda item is agenda item D7, research priorities. And as you remember, we made the decision to move to a triennial review schedule. And we reviewed new research priorities, 5 of them, from the plan teams and other folks that were providing, for example, the FEP provided some research priorities. We reviewed the 2018 top 10 list that we had, that we were essentially revising, and revised and came up with a revised top 10 list for the 2022-2024 period. We were not planning to review critical ongoing monitoring priorities or previously reviewed priorities unless there was a proposal to add, change, or drop a priority. And the SSC supported the new plan team recommended priorities and their ratings as either urgent or important. The SSC recommended that the SSPT provide research priorities for the 2024 review. They haven't done that yet, but we encourage them to do so. The SSC suggests that a date be added to both the top 10 list and the database so that we can see when it was proposed and assess whether or not any progress has been made. The SSC requests that an opportunity to comment on any critical ongoing monitoring is our COM activities, if they were only when if they were slated to be discontinued. And so we recognize that critical ongoing monitoring is an essential part of how the council conducts its business. And so those will continue to roll over every 3 years as high valued activities. But if there was a request to discontinue them, of course, we would want to weigh in. The SSC recommends that an SSC subcommittee will finalize our document summarizing the new processes that we're bringing forward and text for approval in 2021. So we will come up with as in previous examples, there's nothing like research priorities to get scientists excited about talking about different ideas. And we're trying to find ways to streamline the process to really do balance the need for a comprehensive review as well as the needs to have it be somewhat of an expeditious process to bring forward ideas to the council. So in terms of the top 10, we added 2 new research priorities, one of which is Norton Sound red king crab integrated approach as kind of a case study for how one might look at changing management, changing trends in abundance and community response. And we also added a new agenda item on the effects of biological loss from EM because of its role in the importance in the assessment and management of the resources of the North Pacific Council. The latter one, the effects of biological loss from EM, was recommended from the plan team. We retained 4 of the top 10 that were recommended by the crab and groundfish plan teams. They were previously on there, and they continue to be recommended to be high from both of the crab plan and groundfish plan teams. We retained 1 priority that pertained to protected resources, marine mammals and seabirds, and we removed 2 priorities that were specific to abundance-based halibut because of where we are in the process. We're closer to an endpoint. We removed 2 priorities that were instigated prior to 2012, and we revised and added 2 priorities that dealt specifically with building frameworks for data collection for economic and socioeconomic information. And I'm going to skip this slide and go down to the priorities. These are the priorities here. So spatial temporal distribution of crabs relative to life history events and fishing, conducting routine fish, crab, and oceanographic surveys in the Arctic Ocean. And we recognize that that is really a critical ongoing monitoring issue, but because it's not taking place, we felt it should be advanced. The development of a framework to collect economic information, and I mentioned that in the previous discussion of EDRs, developing stock-specific ecosystem indicators to incorporate into stock assessments. This is our nod towards ecosystem-based fisheries management and expanding that effort. Cooperative research efforts to supplement existing at-sea surveys that provide seasonal species specific information on upper trophic levels, developing tools for analyzing coastal community vulnerability and management. That is a new one that we, well, this is one that we have combined pieces of 365 and 431 in this example. Continuing to collect maturity estimates, that is an ongoing need. The collection of socioeconomic information, the gap analysis on the loss of EM, as I mentioned, this was one of the ones that the groundfish plan team brought forward, and then this new integrated approach on Norton Sound red king crab. So I will stop there. That is the end of our discussion on research priorities, and it should. So, any questions from the council?
Thank you, Dr. Holwood. Mr. Twite.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Dr. Holwood, not a question as much as just a comment on the relative importance of surveys in the Arctic. I heard you say as part of that discussion that even though we're not fishing there, and it strikes me that that sort of, so I appreciate the SSC putting it as a high priority, even though we're not fishing there, but I would hope that actually isn't part of the SSC's thinking, because if it is, then you sort of create this cycle that you can't break out of, because under both ours as well as now international agreements, fishing in the Arctic can't commence until there are survey efforts and reasonable estimates of biomass. And so if the SSC had not prioritized it because there was no fishing, that would essentially create the cycle that I worry about. You did prioritize it, that's a good thing, but I would encourage the SSC to remind themselves that it's not an issue of potentially lower price. You don't have to justify it in spite of the fact we're not fishing. It should be justified because that's actually the expected step prior to making any decisions about whether there should be fishing.
Yes, through the chair. And Mr. Twite, yes, absolutely. We recognize the importance of it, and that is our rationale for bringing it forward. It continues to be a need, and finding a way to begin to look at it, and it's becoming an increasing need with the potential movement of Pacific cod into the Chukchi. So the SSC is in agreement with you of its importance.
Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Holwood, on the last slide of the research priorities. So it's number 712, this new one on a gap analysis on the loss of biological samples due to implementation of EM. And I'm just wondering, I don't deny that that's an important research priority, but the council is moving toward EM specifically, for both trawl and fixed gear, but this recommendation seems to go toward the loss of biological data associated with our fixed gear EM program. And I think the SSC has heard from both the observer committees and the council that one of the asks has been to have the Science Center help us evaluate what other opportunities or sources of biological data may help supplement as we move more toward EM, which helps a lot of small boats have monitoring on their vessels, and hopefully at a cheaper cost so we get more coverage. It's a high priority, and I guess I'm just wondering why this research priority is limited to evaluating the effects of fewer samples, biological samples due to EM, as opposed to evaluating, I feel like, what is the council's, one of their primary needs in the expansion of EM, which is what other data sources could we use, surveys or any other approaches for existing data to supplement or make up for some of the lost biological data through EM. That seems like a very pertinent question to me that we've had in front of us. And I'm wondering why it's just limited to evaluating the effects of loss of biological samples instead of how can we further supplement those biological samples as we move into this new EM era.
Through the chair, Ms. Kimball, I think it would include both. I think the first step of it is to identify what's being missed and what has changed in terms of the collection of biological information in response to the deployment of EM. But as you say, finding ways to augment the information to mediate that loss of data is a part of this analysis. So I think that it would be, it addresses both of those sides of the issue.
Okay, thank you. Oh, one more question, Mr. Chair, just because this one is up on the Norton Sound Red King crab case study as an urgent need. I'm just recalling our climate change task force presentation from the last meeting. And I think that the climate change task force had identified this as a possible case study for their work, like testing their processes that are being explored through both the task force for climate change and for LKTK subsistence. So has that decision been made and that's why this is pulled out as a new priority, or is there some other change I'm unaware of? I just was surprised to see this, not knowing whether this was the final decision on that from the task force.
Yes, through the chair, Ms. Kimball, we are not aware of a final decision from the task force. However, I have been on record for several reviews that this is a great opportunity for a case study of integrated research, and that's why we selected it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kimball.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions. Go to the ASEPO. The SSC received a presentation on the ASEPO report. The new annual report focuses on sustained participation of fishing communities engaged in FMP groundfish and crab fisheries. We commend the authors on producing a community-level analysis guided by the NPFMC management objectives and National Standard 8. We concluded that the ASEPO would be a useful resource for staff in the preparation of FMP and program review analyses, as well as for the public. We had a few recommendations on it. These are to, we think, encourage them to incorporate highly engaged communities outside of Alaska, to prioritize adding information on sustained participation or lack thereof of small communities and federally managed fisheries to provide for ease of public access to non-confidential information contained in the report, and to add community dependence indices to supplant the current community engagement indices. And so, I'm sorry, not to supplant, to supplement the current community engagement indices. So we'd like to see both dependence and engagement indices. And I think that's the last of my summary slides for the entire report and for SIPO.
Thank you, Dr. Hollowood. Dr. Balsiger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Dr. Hollowood. That was a long trial for you this morning, and I appreciate the thoroughness you have. So I was reading, interested in the full SSC report on the, I don't know how to pronounce it, ASIPO, I guess, Annual Community Engagement and Participation Review, the D8. You know, and I agree entirely that there should be information included on the Seattle MSA, the Metropolitan Statistical Area. That clearly should be in there and highlighted. I do note that, unlike for the coastal communities, where you suggest that in subsequent bullets in that report, you suggest that the dependence on fisheries ought to be included in those. And in fact, even to the point where splitting up the various taxes that are contributing to the community's well-being, so you can see what comes from landing tax and what comes from those kinds of things. But you don't suggest that for the Seattle MSA that there's any need to have the dependence. I mean, how much does the Seattle MSA depend on Bering Sea fisheries relative to Nome, for example, and things like that? So wouldn't it be important to have that in there as well?
Through the chair, Mr. Balsinger, or Dr. Balsinger, yes, absolutely. Perhaps that was an omission on our part, but the idea, what we are encouraging is that Seattle MSA is added to the report with the full suite of information.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And as I said at the start, I think it's very important. And I didn't go back to see if the Seattle MSA includes down to Newport, Oregon, for example. To me, that ought to be in the table as well. Thank you.
Yes, through the chair and Dr. Balsinger, yes, our hope is that we would incorporate highly engaged communities outside of Alaska, and so that would include other ports as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Balsiger. Any further questions on D8 or any other aspect of the SSC report? If not, thank you for your time this morning, Dr. Hollowood.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, let's go ahead and take a morning break here, and then we'll come back and take action on agenda item D4. So we can come back, let's call it 9:45 Alaska time.
it made sense. Feel free to call me back if you'd like, 443-4242. Thank you.
Council, please come back to order. Ready to move into action for agenda item D4. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a motion for this agenda item that I had sent to council staff. Now, I think they're putting it up right now. Maybe I'll just start reading it. The council adopts the following purpose and need statement and initiates analysis of a suite of IFQ actions with the following alternatives and elements. Purpose and need. IFQ stakeholders, the IFQ committee, and NIMS have identified regulatory revisions that could increase operational efficiency, reduce administrative burden, and clarify how harvesters can meet existing regulatory requirements. In addition, the council is considering revisions to pot limits and gear tending restrictions also identified through the recent 3-year GOA Sablefish pot review to determine whether they are serving their intended purpose. The Community Quota Entity Program was modified in 2014 to include the Aleutian Islands. This allowed the community of ADAC to form a CQE and purchase halib and sablefish quota. Since the implementation of the Aleutian Islands CQE in 2014, ADAC has faced challenges being able to harvest its IFQ. The council is considering temporarily broadening who is eligible to harvest IFQ held by the ADAC CQE to provide more opportunities for more fully harvesting its allocation. Alternative 1, no action. Alternative 2, revise IFQ program regulations to address the following regulatory clarifications. Element 1, clarify that slinky pots are a legal gear for the IFQ fishery and revise regulations to allow the use of biodegradable twine in the door latch or pot tunnel. Element 2, remove buoy configuration and flagpole requirements in regulation, but retain LP marking requirements. Element 3, authorize jig gear as a legal gear type for the harvest of sablefish IFQ. Element 4, revise the pot gear configuration requirements to remove the 9-inch maximum width of tunnel opening so it does not apply when the vessel has unfished halibut IFQ on board. Element 5, pot option 1, change the pot limit for West Jack and or Southeast outside to suboption A, 180 pots per vessel, suboption B, 300 pots per vessel. And element 6, gear retrieval requirements. Option 1, remove the gear retrieval requirement. Option 2, modify the gear retrieval requirement to 7 days for all GOA areas with a sub option for 3 days in Southeast outside. Alternative 3, remove the ADAC CQE residency requirement for a period of 5 years. Note alternatives 2 and 3 are not mutually exclusive. The council supports NIMS initiating rulemaking under its authority to remove notary requirements for IFQ participants and the requirement for sablefish pot fishermen to use pot tags. In addition, the council requests NIMS OLE clarify that they have the discretion to waive gear tending requirements, i.e. if there's a documented mechanical breakdown or a severe weather event. The council requests that NIMS update the council on these issues under the NIMS management report at a future meeting. Mr. Chair, that's my motion.
I'll second it. Jensen.
Second by Mr. Jensen. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to start by thanking our staff and the stakeholders for collaborating on a very thorough review of the Sablefish Pot Program and the IFQ Committee for their work in digging into these issues and helping build consensus where possible and prioritize these actions. This motion is based on our advisory panel's work, but it combines actions under D1 and D4. So I've chosen to move these as an omnibus package to try to streamline our work while accomplishing some items that will make a real difference for the people who are prosecuting this fishery. Speaking under Alternative 2 to Element 1, we clearly heard that confusion about slinky pots being a legal gear type for this fishery is causing concern for fishermen and is stifling innovation. Slinky pots make this gear type accessible to smaller vessels and improve safety. And we certainly don't want to let confusion over something like whether a door is a panel hold back gear development and innovation. So I think this is an easy one to solve, non-controversial. For element 2, we've heard from stakeholders in the fishery that the current marking requirements that require buoys and hardballs and radar reflectors are overkill, and there's actually so much on the end of each line that there's drag and it's causing the gear to go down in the current. However, most stakeholders seem to feel that marking both ends of the string was still a good idea, just so we don't have to be so onerous about how. So again, this is a simple one. For element 3, we have heard that jig gear for sablefish IFQ might allow some small vessels more flexibility in harvesting their sablefish and avoiding whales. Jig gear is already legal for halibut. It might not even have been intentional that it's not legal for sablefish. And I think this is unlikely to be widely adopted, but it could help a few small boat fishermen, and it should be a very simple change. Element 4 may be a bit more complicated. It seems worth exploring to allow folks who have unused halibut IFQ on board to have a wider tunnel and potentially retain those halibut. The IPHC already allows pots as a legal gear type for halibut harvest, and we've heard from stakeholders that they are seeing increased whale predation on halibut. This may be a way for us to get ahead of that a little bit. We certainly did not get ahead of it with whale predation on sablefish, so I am trying to get this flexibility on the table right now. If we find that this opens a can of worms, which I think it might, we can always revisit whether it should be included in this package at a later date. Elements 5 and 6 address the pot limits and the gear tending requirements. These are not consensus items. But they certainly aren't complicated. I think we just need to get some additional information back and a little bit more stakeholder input and determine whether we want to provide additional flexibility in West Yakutat and Southeast Outside or not. Alternative 3 addresses a completely separate issue, and that's allowing the CQE and ADAC more flexibility to get their fish harvested for the next several years. I mean, the council is very aware of the issues faced by the community of ADAC. I don't think I need to go on and on about that, but I do know that there have been tireless efforts by the residents there to build a sustainable fishing community. They purchased this quota. They have internal controls in place to ensure that when resident harvest is possible, that's the priority. And while this probably does not solve the issues in ADAC, it seems simple. It doesn't seem that it harms anyone, and I don't think anyone benefits from insisting that they strand their quota. So for the remainder of the motion, we had a couple simple items. NIMS has indicated that they can take action for the pot tags and the notary requirements under their authority and keep that off the council's plate. The pot tags were identified as something that's burdensome and not adding value because they are not being used to enforce pot limits or really being used by NIMS for anything. And then in terms of the OLE discretion on the gear tending requirements, we heard a lot of concerns about this from the industry, and that is part of what is driving the request for flexibility under element 6. So I think having OLE come back and tell us whether they have the discretion and can use it in cases of a mechanical breakdown or severe weather event would inform our decision on whether element 6 is necessary. So that's what I have, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. Questions from Councilmember Dr. Balsiger?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Ms. Campbell, for the motion. I like it. I think it's a good motion. I appreciate you leaving the pot tags and the notice issues to the region to keep this, to get your words off the council plate. And as you mentioned, a couple of your elements are, I think, non-controversial and relatively easy. Maybe one or two are complicated. So I understand you to say that when this comes back at the first review, we might separate out those things that are not easily accomplished in order to get the other things through. I would be pretty interested in having alternative 3, of course, move through without too much delay, as well as number one on top and maybe some others. But is that your plan?
Through the chair, Dr. Balsiger, yes, it is. I think we have some simple things here that we would like to keep on a quote-unquote fast track and get done as quickly as possible. So if we find that something else is gumming this up, I would perhaps rethink the moving all of these things together as an omnibus at that time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Dr. Foster. Ms. Kimball.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Campbell. One of the things under element one, which I agree element one should go forward, but to revise the regulations to allow the use of biodegradable twine in the Door-Letcher Pot Tunnel. And should I assume that by including that in element one, that is not something that we could clarify the definition of a panel or make some other statement and capture it under your bottom paragraph? I'm assuming what we understand to date is that we need a regulatory change in order to do that. What stakeholders were suggesting we might do by revisiting what a panel means. I'd just like to hear a little bit more about what you've heard on that point.
Through the chair, Ms. Kimball, thank you. So I did work with the agency on this, and my understanding from staff is that the clarification that OLE has provided may not get us there. So they have provided a clarification that that basically relies on one part of the slinky pot being considered the bottom. And since users have no idea of knowing which part of a round pot is the bottom, they don't feel comfortable necessarily with that interpretation. Now, if the agency were to come back and say, you know what, we can take care of this under our authority, I would be overjoyed. But that's just not something I've heard so far.
Thank you. I could possibly ask the agency that question after other questions on the actual motion get asked. Thank you.
Further questions on the motion? Amendments to offer. Mr. Downs.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Cora, for your motion. I don't have an amendment to offer, Mr. Chairman, but I just wanted to note that I'd considered an amendment on the small sablefish release, and I plan to comment on that after we take action before we leave this agenda item. So I just thought I'd note that now rather than bring it up, but I will be bringing that up after we take action on Ms. Campbell's motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Downs. There are no amendments to offer, then and go to comments on the motion. Mr. Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Campbell, for the motion. I appreciate what the IFQ committee did and distilling this down to this omnibus package and the way you presented it. So I appreciate that. I just wanted to make a note that I think I really support the Aleutian Islands part of that. I think that's an important, and as you stated, not necessarily going to hurt anybody, but could be extremely helpful. It's one of those rewards with very little risk involved in it. So appreciate that part of it specifically. Thank you for your motion.
Ms. Kimball.
Well, Mr. Chair, I was trying to find an appropriate time to see if I could ask the agency about my prior question. So maybe I can just hold off and give them some time to think about that. My question, to reiterate, is whether the portion of element one on revising regulations to allow the use of biodegradable twine in the Door-Letcher Pot Tunnel, is that necessary, or is there a possibility that NIMS has the alternative approach to clarify with OLE the definition of a panel?
So not that element one isn't necessary in the long term, but is there also a sooner or quicker response to this that we could consider? So I'm just going to leave that up. Agency can respond. I'd appreciate it. Otherwise, I'm very supportive of the motion.
Thanks. It looks like Ms. Miller may be ready to take that on. Ms. Miller?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the question, Nicole. For the record, Alicia Miller, National Marine Fisheries Service. And to get at this idea of using biodegradable twine as a door latch on the slinky pot, that would need to be a regulatory change. We can put out, and we have updated our frequently asked questions that are applicable to the GOA IFQ sablefish pot fishery to identify that the location and the fact that slinky pots are round and don't have a discernible top or bottom, we have clarified that our interpretation that that's not a problem for the use of slinky pots. So the location of the panel is not a concern. We could add another question to that to clarify what a panel means, to identify the distinction between what we're calling a door latch and a panel. So that is something that we could do, but to specifically authorize the use of what we've recently come to learn is this door latch idea would need to be a regulatory change. So I guess a little of both. We could clarify what we mean and put it in writing, what a panel means, at least our current interpretation. And then if the council wishes this door latch idea to move forward, or the use of twine in the tunnel opening to be an exception to that panel requirement, then that would need to be changed in regulation. Thank you.
Before I go on to further questions on or comments on the motion, I'd like to see if anybody wanted to follow up on Ms. Miller's comments there. Ms. Kimball, did that get at your?
I suppose I might just be having a hard time today, Mr. Chair, understanding the response. Maybe I should just understand whether there's an opportunity for the agency to write an FAQ that describes a different definition of a panel, such that we would resolve this problem. And maybe that's just a yes or no answer. The agency is not going to consider that. And then I will leave this alone and move on to the rest of the substance of the motion. Thank you.
Through the chair, Ms. Kimball, yes, we can update our FAQ, but I don't think it gets at the door latch question.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks for that motion, Cora. That's a great motion. I'll go through the different ones. Slinky pots, I really think that's a very innovative idea, and it's going to make it so smaller boats, in the 40-foot class, can actually go out and use these pots and avoid whale depredation. So that's going to work really well. I know several boats around town in the 40-foot class, maybe some a little bit smaller, are rigging up with the slinky pots. And the biodegradable issue, it's sort of hard to find a bottom of a cylindrical pot. I guess it would be just opposite of where the bridle is, but they roll around on the bottom, so there's really not any bottom or sides to the pot. The idea of using the door mechanism on the end of the pot and having a cotton biodegradable twine on that is a good idea if we can get that in through the regulatory process. The buoy marking was very cumbersome, what was there. I'd like to see that removed. I agree with the motion on that handling two balls and a hard ball and a flagpole, and if you're a two-man boat, it'd be a real goat show there on that one. So I'm going to be supportive of this. I think it's an excellent. It covers everything I was concerned about. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Twice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Campbell, thank you very much for the motion. I support it, and my comments are maybe more germane to following process rather than the motion itself. I think there's two issues here that this motion sort of flags in a way. One is an issue just of how our current regulatory process can stymie innovation. And elements 1 and 2, for instance, I think are a great example of that problem. And it seems to me that in both cases, we expect continuing innovation, continuing development, continuing adaptation on both of these issues. And if we have to touch those each time something new comes up along those lines, it's cumbersome, it's inefficient, and it's economically often cumbersome or negative for the harvesters themselves as well as the gear developers. I question why both of these aren't candidates for performance standard type regulations, where we describe the outcome that we want for the gear, but not try to tell the fleet exactly how to achieve that outcome. And the outcome in both cases, I think we all have a fairly clear idea that we are concerned about, for instance, with biodegradable. We know the problem that we're concerned about. We know how we want pots to be configured so that they minimize that problem. But we shouldn't be expecting ourselves as a council or the agency to be describing exactly how that should happen. When we do that, and then innovation occurs, we end up with these nonsensical situations where we're spending council time talking about trying to find the bottom of the cylinder or whether it doors a panel. That's not a good use of our time, and I would strongly encourage the agency to, well, on the one hand, I don't want either of these slowed down, but this is an opportunity to start thinking about performance standard-based regulation. And if there's anything the council can do to help with that discussion, to help with that dialogue, because we're going to have more of these, I think that's ultimately going to save all of us some, create a more efficient process for all of us. The second thought I have isn't as much part of the regulatory process as it is thinking about the level of effort that it takes to move issues like elements 1, 2, 3, or even alternative 3 through the process. I'd like, and again, not as part of this particular issue, but I think I'd like to bookmark a little bit for staff tasking, to have some discussion about whether the council and the agency can develop a process where an issue comes up, the council gives an initial nod after some work by a committee, in this case, the IFQ committee. The council gives an initial nod, yes, that looks really good to us. And unless a problem comes up as it's worked through the process, we don't need to hear about it again. Or the council gives an initial nod and says, when there's a final product, we'll take another quick look at it to see if it's still consistent with our initial expectation. Put some more of the work back onto just a committee and a committee process, and have issues like this occupy less of council floor time. I'd really like to explore that as well. And at least in my judgment, maybe this is going to be part of the problem, but elements 1, 2, 3, and alternative 3, I think are all great candidates for that kind of light touch sort of council process. And again, I don't think we need to discuss that any further relative to this motion. But I do want to reserve some time at staff tasking to talk some more about whether it's worth our time to try to develop a light touch versus intensive work process and separate out some of these components, because I think that would fit exactly the spirit that, for instance, Ms. Kimball's initial question of Ms. Campbell elucidated. So again, thanks, Ms. Campbell, for the motion. I think it's really well crafted. Finally, I just will note, in response to Mr. Downs' point, I would strongly support some additional discussion about small sablefish, but given those other points I just made, it's a little difficult to work in small sablefish into the process right now.
Thank you, Mr. Twite. Mr. Marks.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Ms. Campbell, for the motion. I think it's a great motion. You know, real positive results from what we saw from the pot fishery and what can be achieved there. So very much in support of that. And the alternative 3 just seems like that's a pretty simple one. We just need to get that done. But these are very practical options and elements that hopefully we can move forward in a very straightforward way. I think to Mr. Twite's comment, we heard from a number of folks testifying that to give them flexibility. I'm compelled to do that, and I think just allow them the room to move to further develop this gear type and these fisheries. You know, certainly red flags may crop up, and let's deal with those. But otherwise, I like that thought. So anyway, thanks again for the motion, and a lot of thought and work went into this by you and the IFQ committee and a lot of other folks. So glad to see it going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. Mr. Mesereau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Campbell. The IFQ committee has had a lot of longtime stakeholders with a lot of strong opinions, and I think you did a great job of trying to hear everybody out and come up with good solutions in this motion. I didn't comment earlier, but that survey that the staff came up with really helped me clarify the nature of people's concerns as individuals in the IFQ committee, and it was incredibly helpful. I hope we can use that in other committees that have a workload too. It's just really helpful to get everyone's opinion without having to get everyone's opinion. So that was really good. And I agree with this motion, and particularly the structure of this omnibus package where we're putting things together. I echo the concerns of Mr. Twite about the cumbersome nature of our process when we're dealing with relatively simple fixes. And I think the first step is the way that you propose this motion here in this format, where we'll deal with them all as a group and move as many forward as we can that promote efficiency. And I think this is a good start, but I too would like to have a little discussion in the future about simple fixes to regulatory solutions that don't have to go through our entire regulatory process. It's daunting, and I've spent years now on this council going through items that only help a few people. And while we want to help everybody, it seems like if we have a clear solution to a clear problem, going through our entire regulatory process to help a small group of fishermen, there has to be an easier way to do it. So I would welcome looking at ways to simplify our process to solve simple problems and process to solve complicated problems. So I do support the motion and the work you did, and I appreciate that. And that's all I have for you.
Thanks, Mr. Mesereau. Ms. Bush.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't take much time here. Thank you for your motion, Ms. Campbell. I think this does a good job of squeezing in all of the issues that the IFQ committee identified as their highest priorities and does so very efficiently. I agree with what others have said about element 1. I do support making a regulatory change to this. I think we need increased flexibility in the definition of our escape mechanisms to allow for gear innovation. And so, you know, if there is a quick fix for this specific issue we have here under element 1, I do support a quick fix to that, but I also support keeping it in the package to get some regulatory flexibility. There's only so many ways that a pot can open after it's sat on the bottom for a long time, and I think we can revise our definitions to be broad enough to not stifle any future gear innovation. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just briefly, that yes, I support the motion, and I think it's interesting other council members comments on using this as an example of ways where we could better our process. I actually see this as kind of the best we can do. We went through a committee process. They did their best to try to prioritize. And then instead of working through multiple discussion papers for fairly simple issues, we went straight to, an analytical package, pretty tight, with alternatives and options defined so that we get this back as soon as possible. So I agree that anywhere we can, especially for simple issues, we should provide a more streamlined process. But in my mind, this is as streamlined as we can get. And I appreciate going right to an analysis for these issues. I also appreciate Dr. Balsiger's comments and agree that if there's one or two that become cumbersome, that we seriously consider, removing those in order to get these other more simple ones on a faster track. So thank you for the motion and the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Kimball. Dr. Balsiger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Kimball said pretty much what I was going to. I don't think we should see this as a failed process at this point. The IFQ committee did great work. We got a nice package together. And I know we've debated a different issue in the background. So I'll just say, if we're thinking about this discussion of staff tasking, NPFMC is pretty happy to manage the whole fisheries. But if you write it in for our in-season management guys to do it occasionally, when we have those opportunities to change things without council input, we get in trouble for them. So the sword cuts both ways on this. So as we get to this in staff tasking, keep that in mind. Thanks.
Mr. Mesereau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one clarifying question that is not going to determine whether I support this or not, but I'm just wondering, I know this is a little out of turn, but I'm sure Ms. Campbell can answer it easily and it'll help in the future. The question regarding element 2, regarding flagpole requirements, do you mean a flagpole with a radar reflector on it or not, or either or both? I guess I'm just wondering. That's the only clarifying question I have, and like I said, it doesn't change the forward. It just might help in the analysis.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Mesereau, I actually don't. I think that's a level of specificity we shouldn't even have in the regulations. I think the regulation should say that both ends of the string need to be marked, and not whether or not it's a flagpole, and not whether or not that flagpole has a radar detector and reflector, and just let folks figure out how to mark the ends of their strings. What the industry would really like is the ability to use AIS. And that would solve a lot of these problems. That's a separate issue that I plan to bring up during staff tasking for yet another letter writing exercise in an attempt to get a federal agency to be sensible. Not your agency, Dr. Balsiger.
I'm good with sensibility in my agency, so help us out.
All right. Any further comments on the motion before we vote? Don't see any. Thank you, Ms. Campbell, for bringing this forward, and again for all your leadership and great work with the ISQ committee. All right. Is there any opposition to the motion? Seeing and hearing none, the motion passes unanimously. Further action on agenda item D4. Mr. Downs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Campbell, for the motion that was just passed unanimously. I was strongly in support of that. I think that one of the issues I would like to comment on, and I chose to do this after we took action on Ms. Campbell's motion, rather than to muddy the waters with her motion. I don't have a motion on this, but I just wanted to signal, because we've heard extensive testimony on the small sablefish release. We've seen a motion passed by the AP at the February meeting. We saw a extensive report that was a considerable expense to the fishing fleet to to analyze the effects of small sablefish release. We saw that at this meeting that was presented to us by Dr. Ian, who was hired, I think, by the a subgroup or a group of folks connected with Fishing Vessel Owners Association. I thank them for that. We've seen an awful lot of response and requests that this take place. But with Ms. Campbell's motion, you know, it really was, as I think Ms. Campbell aptly described, you know, it was a tight analytical package and it was streamlined. And I really appreciated that she took these things that can all fit into one package, trying to fit small sablefish release into that package through an amendment. I was convinced was going to complicate matters quite a bit. But then we still have these outstanding issues with small sablefish, and we've got some issues with that were brought up by the SSC and others from the agency that include the low observer coverage in that fleet, and that might not be adequate to estimate the volumes of discards. We had a second concern with the EM method of trying to estimate the size of a fish. Do we go with the 58, 59 centimeter or the 3-pound dress weight fish? And so how do you estimate that? That was a problem. And then the DMRs, they could take years to figure out a good DMR, and what should that be? So this is not item for the council without complexity. So it didn't really align well with the IFQ. I appreciate Ms. Campbell's keeping that streamlined, as I'd said. According to Dr. Ian's presentation, and I hope that those that maybe have not read that can go back and read that, including the staff that analyzed this in the first place, to see if in the future, if we do go forward with this, that could be somewhat helpful. I realize that this is a industry report. It's not to be considered staff analysis, but it did bring up a very good point that the Bering Sea using a 17% discard mortality rate, this could be as low as 66 metric tons. And considering the 8 million pounds that was over harvested by the trawl fleet and discarded in our last calendar year, it's a very, very small amount. You know, it's a very small fraction. So I do think that said, it's a complex issue. I wanted to bring this up. I don't know if other council members would like to comment on their intentions on this, but I don't intend to see this issue dropped. It was recommended by the AP. It also had 85% support at the IFQ committee, which was in the range of the other items that we just supported as a priority item. So a vast majority of the folks at the IFQ committee did feel that this was an issue that should be elevated to a high priority. So I plan to work on this between this meeting and our June meeting, and perhaps over the summer as well, to try to work with National Marine Fisheries Service staff and perhaps Mr. Witherall to try to find out what, you know, are the major roadblocks here that might be able to help us streamline this somewhat before just bringing forward a motion. I actually had a motion ready today that I was willing to bring forward, but in looking at it and conferring with other council members, there are complexities issue that probably make this not quite the right timing to be doing that. But I just, again, I'll stop with just signaling to industry that I don't intend to drop this issue. I hope other council members will keep this at the forefront of their thoughts. It's something that I think we're going to continue to hear about, but I will work on this a bit more. Also, one of the considerations of not bringing this forward at this time was the staff availability. We've got some very major issues. We'll know more about that, I think, in the coming couple of meetings and staff tasking to be able to better assess that. But my sense as one council member is that we've got some major issues and that we don't want to be adding a priority item that could be a big analysis. I don't know that it needs to be, but it could be without some further work here. So I'll continue to work on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me the time under the ISQ committee report to bring up that. I thought we owed it to the industry to articulate well our intentions and why this was not included in the motion that we just passed. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Down. Mr. Twite.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate Mr. Down bringing that forward. I'm also interested in seeing further discussion on it. In my mind, there's two concerns that we still have not really resolved yet, and I think are important to resolve relative to this issue. One is just making sure we're treating all the sectors equally in terms of the impact of these large age classes on their fisheries. And I'm not convinced that we are applying the same standard to all sectors right now, and I think we should be. Secondly, I'm concerned about any factor which would encourage fixed-gear fishermen to behave differently when they have observers on board and when they don't, and which might also be a disincentive to wanting to work with observers, and might be an incentive to trying to avoid observer coverage, as well as might be a disincentive to adding EM. And I think, again, there's small sablefish release potentially serves as a disincentive to us operating both our human and our EM observer. And I'd like to see both of those issues looked into more. So I appreciate Mr. Down bringing that forward, and I'll work with him as well.
Dr. Baltzger.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure it's necessary to add on, but I agree with both Mr. Down and Mr. Twite that, a long time ago population dynamics guy I am, and the idea that killing small sablefish is somehow consistent with good management, that hasn't gone over well with me. So I look forward to whatever Mr. Down can put together in the summertime, working with whatever parts of NIMS we have to, and I also would like to see this looked at in the future. So thank you for that. I also appreciate you not piling it on here. I think you're right in all respects in terms of staff time and in terms of slowing down these motions. So I think you did it exactly right. Thank you.
Anything further in D4? Everyone? Okay, with that, we are ready to move on to agenda item C1. You can stand down for a minute while Mr. Armstrong prepares for the presentation. Stay close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Jim Armstrong. And if admin could please add me as a presenter, and also Tyler Jackson, who is on the attendee list, as well as Scott Miller.
All right, great. Whenever you're ready.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the Council, under this agenda item, the action for the Council is to approve 2021 Scallop Safe and adopt OFL and ABC for scallops for the 2021-22, that is 2021-2022 scallop fishing year. The materials are under C1 and include this presentation, which should be brief. The SSC and AP have provided their reports on this agenda item. And we have, I'm going to go ahead and do the next slide, Mr. Jackson. This is the Scallop Plan Team. I just kind of put a spotlight on Tyler Jackson at the top of the list there, who was approved for membership on the team last year, and he's now the Plan Team co-chair. Just sort of by way of introduction. And so I think Mr. Jackson could probably take it from there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will walk through the items that were included in the SAFE this year. As a reminder, we did an abbreviated SAFE document or executive summary based on SSC recommendations from the previous year. So despite the pandemic, we were able to complete a 2020 ADF&G dredge survey, and this survey covered scallop beds in the Kodiak Shelikof and Kodiak Northeast districts. So those are two of the major harvest areas in the Kodiak registration area. The survey flip-flops between these two districts and the Yakutat district, which are the main focus of the surveys. We report abundance and biomass, or CPUE, in this table here of scallops in two size groups. Larger or equal to 100 millimeters, which corresponds to the size where you start to see retention in the fishery, and it's about the size of the ring gear on the ring mesh, on the dredge, the commercial dredge, and then less than that. In Kodiak Shelikof, we saw an increase relative to the previous time it was surveyed in 2018, because we see a transitioning of cohorts coming from the smaller size class to the larger size class. In the Kodiak Northeast district, we saw variation of this pattern across the different beds. Three of the beds in the Kodiak Northeast district were not surveyed in the prior to this survey. In 2017 would be the last time that district was surveyed. Of particular note, there was a rather large increase in the Kodiak Northeast 3 bed, which is owing to a pretty large cohort moving through. And I'll just note, even though it wasn't surveyed, Kodiak Northeast 5 had some of the highest CPUE of this larger size class out of all those Northeast beds. The meat weight biomass generally will follow the CPUE of the large size class. Meat weight biomass is only collected on large scallops, the ones that are considered to be commercially available. And in this case, we saw the same pattern as we saw with CPUE. One interesting thing to point out is across the board, we saw a continued decrease in the meat weight to shell height, individual meat weight shell height relationship, and following meat weight to round weight relationship. And in previous SAFE reports, we implicated the possibility that there could be additional stress on the organism caused by warming ocean temperatures or pH decreasing more acidity. But looking at some of the data from this survey and in prior years, considering gonad conditions, we're investigating now a hypothesis that there could be a shift in reproductive timing that's causing, because of allocation to different processes, we could be seeing that meat weight reduction during certain times of the year where it might have occurred during a time where we wouldn't have surveyed before. I presented during the Scallop Plan Team meeting data on the ADF&G Large Mesh Trawl Survey. This survey is annual, and it's crab focused. There are stations throughout the Kodiak management area and along the Alaska Peninsula and in the beginning of the Aleutian Islands and the Dutch Harbor area. This survey will provide an index of abundance going back to 1999 of scallops, and an index of scallop biomass, round weight biomass, going back even further into, I believe, 88. Looking at this map, in the green there, showing commercial dredge locations over the recent history compared to the survey grid. And most of the overlap between these two, what the fish stock is, and where the survey occurs, happens in this Kodiak, Shelikof, and Kodiak Northeast districts. And so for these two areas, which are major harvest areas, this survey could provide a longer time series of abundance and biomass than the dredge survey, which is new, only has occurred since 2016, can provide for development of a stock assessment model. The 2019-20 Scallop Fishery, I'm sorry, my notes disappeared on me. One moment. Here we are. Sorry about that.
No problem. Whenever you're ready.
The GHLs have been on this long decline since the early 2000s, but they plateaued in the most recent 3 years. In 2019-20, GHL was 200,000 and 267,500 pounds of shuck meats. And the total retained catch was 229,945 pounds of shuck meats. GHLs were met in specific harvest areas, including